Hi, I'm Ron James with the Center for Ethical Business Cultures in the Opus College of Business at the University of St. Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us as we take another look at ethical insights. Today we want to focus on the whole notion of working across culture, business and ethics in China. We're excited to have with us today Dr. Daryl Koehn. She's a recognized expert in China and doing business in China and ethics in China. And we're elated because she's just recently returned from a trip in China. Dr. Koehn hails from the Opus College of Business at the University of St. Thomas and is a professor in business ethics. Thanks so much for being with us today, Daryl.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Daryl, you've just recently been in China. What were themes as you reflect back on the trip that stood out to you?
Well, I guess I'm always struck when I go to China by the immense population and how that affects people's thinking. So the large population, I think the power of local governments that sometimes we Americans don't focus on so much, collectivism in China, and then I guess what you could call management by relationship or management by guan, to use the Chinese term.
These are fascinating topics. Let's take them one at a time. And let's go to this population observation that you had. Normally, multinational corporations think about the large population of China as a business opportunity. But how do Chinese think about the population in China?
Yes, you've zeroed in on the crucial point. I think that when you're in China, you hear the government talking about the population as something always to be managed and as a potential threat. Interestingly, the Mandarin word for population, or at least one of the words, is renkou, people's mouths. And that should already give us a kind of clue that in China, the issue is how to keep people fed. Historically, that's been a very big problem because the population has always been relatively large in China. So the Chinese government and Chinese academics, I would say, worry a lot about people being hungry and the problem of social instability. So that's an ongoing theme in China. A couple of years ago, the Chinese government announced that their big national theme would be social harmony and social stability. So every conference done in China, or many of them, had to touch upon that theme.
Well, population is very important. How does government work inside of China? A multinational corporation, how should they think about government in China?
Well, I guess in general, they need to remember that although the system is centralized, there are local governments, which I think we can talk about in a little bit, and the local governments have quite a lot of power. And I guess that if I were a multinational coming to China, I would be really focused not just on what I want for the company, but how the Chinese government is likely to see an issue. So let's take a topic like intellectual property. A lot of multinationals are very worried about that in China. And they, of course, see intellectual property as a matter of property rights for the firm and as a protection of their investment in research and development into the firm. And that's quite natural that they would see it that way. But I think the Chinese government is going to see intellectual property again in terms of social stability. So as part of reform, the state-owned enterprises shed many, many people. And those people, they need to eat, right? Again, people's mouths. And many of those people who've been let go from the SOEs are now manufacturing counterfeit goods. There's a huge business in counterfeit goods in China. In fact, there are whole local cities that are pretty much devoted to the production of counterfeit goods. So that means that I would argue the Chinese government is not immediately going to shut down those operations, because what are those folks going to do? How are they going to feed themselves? So an MNC who is interested in intellectual property might want to think about how they could make an argument that protecting intellectual property rights would in the long run, let's say, lead to social stability. So when they're engaging with the government, they should always think about that government's perspective. What is going to be done that's going to increase or decrease social harmony or social stability, and perhaps try to tailor their arguments in a meaningful and truthful way to that concern.
And is there a distinction between the centralized government and the local government?
Sure. I think in America we think about a kind of monolithic China with a very strong controlling central government. And I don't want to downplay the power of the central government. It's real. We know there's a lot of censoring of Weibo, Twitter, and stuff like that. But I think that people need to remember that historically local government officials have been very powerful as well. In fact, there's a saying in China, Tian Gao Huang Di Yuan, heaven is high and the emperor is very far away. And I don't know if you could exactly translate it as while the cat's away, the mice will play, but there certainly is some sense there that we're the local officials on the ground and we can do what we want. And in fact, there's an interesting artwork I saw that was part of a scroll painting of camels in the desert, and they're talking to each other, saying Tian Gao Wang Di Yuan. And I think the subtext there is they're in the desert, which is the western part of China, Xinjiang, and the central government in Beijing is, thousands of miles away, so that they have some relative autonomy there. And that should matter to local businesses in a couple of ways. First of all, it means that I think that companies should not just think about going to China, but they need to think about which province they're going to in China. And there are real differences. Shanghai, for example, is very business friendly. So that would be one aspect of things.
So you have to think broadly at what happens at the central government as well as locally what happens at that government stage.
Right, and that's an important point because some local governments might be more corrupt than others. Local government corruption is a huge problem that's openly talked about by academics. For example, I was at a conference, and it was about 5 years ago, and a government official from Beijing was sitting in on our subgroup on business ethics. And it was interesting because this government official was the chief editor for the chief Communist Party paper. So it would be like the editor of Pravda in the Soviet Union sitting in on your session. And I was interested to see whether or not my Chinese colleagues would self-censor. And I didn't hear a lot of self-censorship. They were openly talking about corruption, but primarily corruption at the local government level.
Okay. So are there any other implications that businesses should think about at the local government level?
Well, I guess I would just caution businesses that if they run into trouble with, let's say, a contractual dispute at the local level, they may have to just deal with the local government, and they may not get a lot of help from the central party government, because the central government may not feel like it wants to step into a power struggle with that local government.
Understand. What about cultural uniqueness? Can you talk a little bit about cultural unique differences in China, please?
Well, I guess I'm always a little bit careful about things like Asian values or Chinese uniqueness because things change over time. Cultures are permeable. But I think I would say that China is largely still a collectivist country with some emphasis on individual integrity that comes out of the Confucian tradition. And I think I would say that the Chinese are extremely pragmatic. They've had to learn over the years how to do workarounds in a bureaucratic system. So the pragmatism of the people really always strikes me.
And when you say collectivist, what does that mean, please?
Well, I guess it means that there's always going to be a focus on the we. Every time I'm in China, I'm really struck by the fact that presenters from the government and from academia will talk about we Chinese. And I don't think when you go to an American conference you have people say so much we Americans. It means that at the business level, there has to be a kind of consciousness about the business as a community that's operating in the larger Chinese community. So I think one of the mistakes that American business people commit when they go to China is they focus a lot upon what's in it for the company and maybe what's in it for them as individuals, but they don't talk as much as they probably should about the we-ness in the Shanghai office, for example. I interviewed someone from a major American company who was one of the most successful people ever to operate in China. He was Chinese American. And he told me an interesting story about how he accounted for his success basically by two things. One was that he would always take the company van in with all the other workers in the morning. So he didn't separate himself as senior management off from every other person in the local office. So they all had that morning trip in together. And even the company car that was given to him as a perk, he immediately gave back to the group, and he said, it's really the company car. So any of you who need this car to do business, company business, can use the car. It's the company car. Yes. It's not my perk. And that, he said, went a long way towards building sort of social solidarity and showing respect for the we of the Chinese the Chinese group who's working in that company.
Exactly, a strong commitment to community. So fascinating. You were talking about relationships and how they show up, the collectivism shows up in a home setting. What about in a business setting? How might it show up?
Well, the food point would show up in a business setting as well, a business dinner.
okay.
But I think more broadly, you could say that management in China is by relationship or by relationship capital. They use the term guan, so management by guan. And what that means is a lot of things get done in China by means of whom you know. And that's true in America too, but I would say it's even more true in China. So for example, the Chinese people work their connections that are family connections, historical connections, alumni connections. All connections matter in China. And I think the implication for business here is that if you run into some kind of difficulty, you're more likely to resolve the problem through guanxi than through the rule of law. I would say the rule of law is still very underdeveloped in China by American or Western standards. And you read about cases, for example, where an American firm has trouble with the supplier, and they want to try to enforce the contract. And their Chinese colleagues will advise them, no, let's resolve this by contacting a colleague or a fellow student, Tongshui, and they'll work out things through by means of whom they know, rather than going to the court system. And I think I would say that businesses need to cultivate guanxi, not just in an instrumental, extractive way, to use your phrase earlier, but by showing that they're genuinely friendly towards the Chinese, and that they're intent upon being in China in the long haul and making things work in a way that's good for them, but also good for the local Chinese firms and the local Chinese population.
And that circles back to where you started, and it's this notion of population and how businesses will be viewed. Very important not to be viewed as coming to extract from, but rather to invest in what's happening in China.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
Dr. Koehn, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing with us your insights into business and ethics in China. Thank you very much for joining us today and looking at ethical insights. I'm Ron James with the Center for Ethical Business Cultures, and we look forward to you joining us on the next Ethical Insight. Have a good day.